So contextual emergence opens the way for, and I'm going to say is best characterized as neutral monism. So neither mind nor matter is inherently physical or mental. Neutral monism allows us to tell a relational story about mind, just as we did with matter. So, skip that bit. So here's a quote from James. A given undivided portion of experience, taken in one context of associates, plays the part of the knower, or a state of mind, or consciousness, while in a different context, the same undivided bit of experience plays the part of a thing known, of an objective content. In a word, in one group it figures as a thought, in another group as a thing. So James is pointing out that one of the reasons we keep ending up at things like dualism or panpsychism or strong emergence or whatever is it's built into our phenomenology of everyday experience. That out there is the external world, nor ordinary everyday experience, right? You know, drugs and meditation, all that different story. But out there is the external world, and it's made of matter. And in here is me, you, I, the self, the subject, right? And I live behind my eyes, and there is this deep subject-object cut, and I'm a conscious being, and that's the material world. And what James is pointing out is, while it certainly seems that way, that is, to reify that, is to actually turn your experience into a philosophical position. You're making an inductive inference. So James says, my thesis is that if we start with the supposition that there is only one primal stuff or material in the world, in my view, don't think about that as substance. Think about that as just relations. A stuff of which everything is composed, and if we call that stuff pure experience, the knowing can easily be explained as a particular sort of relation towards one another into which portions of experience may enter. The relation itself is a part of pure experience. One of its terms becomes the subject or the bearer of knowledge, the knower, the other becomes the object known. So it's hard to, our everyday experience is so inherently dualist, it's very hard to wrap your mind around this idea, I think. So I'm going to call this fundamental neutral stuff pure presence. James calls it pure experience, but the problem is that makes you think of something mental right away, or it makes you think of sense data. So by using the language he did, he sort of ended up getting misinterpreted. But this is the idea, right? So the knower and the known are just two, I would say, aspects of these neutral relations, right? Subject and object are two sides of the same coin, not essentially different things. Here's how Russell put it. This one I think is more straightforward. But because Russell sometimes advocated panpsychism, it's a little problematic to use him as an advocate for neutral monism. But he was a neutral monist at times, and this is what he says. The whole duality of mind and matter is a mistake. There's only one kind of stuff, and again, you shouldn't, in my view, don't think of stuff, don't think of substance. These are old notions we don't need, out of which the world is made, and this stuff is called mental in one arrangement and physical in another, right? So whatever you want to think of as fundamental, it's not physics, and it's not mind, it's not matter, it's not material, it's neutral between those. And it has both of those aspects. So again, because of experience, we tend to carve the world at the joints in a certain way. We tend to think of physical and mental as being binary oppositions. We think of inner and outer as being binary oppositions. So when I close my eyes and I engage in mental rotations, I think of that as being inside my head. When I open my eyes and I think of that as being out there. And then we reify that distinction. Likewise with subject and object. But James's point and other people is that's not a datum. That's an inductive projection. So in other words, you're engaging in a metaphysical conclusion and you don't, neither science nor experience demands that of you. So another way to put it is that the hard problem is a cognitive illusion, right? Experience isn't inherently or essentially mental, and the external world isn't inherently non-mental. Here's how I would put it. Relations are fundamental and they are neutral. Everything else emerges from these relations or are patterns in these relations. Get rid of all these Lego metaphors like composition or determination or built up out of. That's all stuff that's the way to atomist things. But not here. These are networks of relations. And so instead of saying, as Ladyman and Ross do, everything must go, we say no, everything must emerge from this network of relations. And it's also advocating direct realism. So there is no, we don't, in this view, that this neutral monist view, we're not mediating the environment with representations in the grand sense of representation with a capital R. I'm not saying that we never use representations of any sort, right? I'm saying that there is no layer perceptually, right, between us and the world. We interact directly with it. In fact, the world and us are one system, two facets of the same thing. So we don't, on this picture, where we are coupled with the environment, you can think about this mathematically if you wanted, like nonlinear coupling or something. We don't need representations to mediate our interaction with the world. So where am I in this picture? This is a takeoff on Dennett, of course. The phenomenological world of experience is neither in the head nor in the external world as nominally, meaning that in the Kantian sense, conceived. Neither is the self. Both are two sides of the same relational coin. What am I? Many other people have said this. Zahavi is a scholar, a phenomenologist, and a Husserl scholar. And a lot of other traditions have tried to get at this idea. We can say that the minimal subject in the external world co-arise. You can't have one without the other. So a lot of people, existentialists, phenomenologists, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, by the way, Buddhism and Hinduism, I could find many, many, many other traditions that say similar things in a different way. But in my language, there's a self-consistency relation between self and world. So here's my cheesy, there's nothing deep about this. This is my cheesy way of depicting it, right? So we all know this Gestalt image. And I just use this to visually depict the idea that there's no self without a world and there's no world without a self. And maybe a way to try to sell this to some of you is to really think about the phenomena. I'm willing to take phenomenology seriously as a basis for my, making inferences about the nature of reality. So I don't know if, even if you're not a meditator or whatever, think about it. You go to sleep at night. Well, you go into deep sleep. And what happens? The self goes away and the world goes away, right? And presumably there's nothing left. And then you wake up. The self and the world come back online together. Two sides of the same coin. And if you meditate, if you have meditated in some tradition for a while, you'll notice when you get into a really deep state of meditation, this is where phenomenology and Buddhism meet, and there's a lot of literature about this, that the self goes away and the world goes away. The subject-object distinction goes away. There is something left over. I call it pure presence. You can call it, Hindus might call it the witness consciousness. You can also call it nowness. That feeling, that specialness, right, of the present moment. That's another thing about phenomenology we all know about. There's something special about the present, right? Like now, right? Those other hand claps don't feel the same way, right? And going further back, you remember stuff, doesn't feel the same way. There's a special phenomenological thing connected to the present. And I want to say that that is fundamental. And I want to say that that's exactly what's left over when the subject-object system dissolves. And again, you can find this idea in many traditions. So, now again, Kant says things like this, but he wants to explain this in terms of some category, right? Some filter in your head, okay? So he thinks that, that we're, it's canned. We have these categories of space and time and all these sort of things, and that's why we experience things in a certain way. And we just can't say anything about the noumenal world. All we can talk about is the phenomenal world as it's been canned by these, as a neuroscientist would think of them, some internal mechanisms or categories. And I think Kant is right, except for the story about it being internal. So if neutral monism is right, you can think about thought and mentation and conceptualization and all that stuff that we associate with the mental is on the same plane with clouds and trees, right? We impose a metaphysical separation of them as being categorically distinct, right? But you don't need to do that. The world doesn't have to be like that. And the same thing goes for Husserl. He's very concerned about the passage of time and the experience of time, and he proposes this inner representation of the passage of time. So he also, right? And he feels obligated to bracket phenomenology or experience, right? because he's freaked out about science and philosophy and all that. And what I'm telling you is we should unbracket. We should have never separated phenomenology and experience from science to begin with. So the idea, again, is that the subject and the object and the world and space and time are both necessary and sufficient for one another. They co-determine each other. This is one system. So unlike Kant and Schopenhauer and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, you don't need some internal mechanism, structure, something inside the head that does this trick. It's already the nature of reality. And again, you can find this being in time. I'm making these are quotes from Heidegger. You can find this kind of thinking a lot of places. He says, human life does not happen in time, but rather is time itself. Or that time is interwoven with consciousness. That's what I'm saying here. And I think that he's saying the same sort of thing that I'm trying to say here as well. He also said this, irrationality thrived when lived experience was excluded from science. And I'm saying this was the fundamental mistake that we made in the West that leads to all these odious schisms. He talked about everydayness too. I'm almost done. So hopefully, with all this in mind, we should be able to transcend Husserl's inner representations, Kantian categories, the poison of mind versus matter, inner, outer, subjective, objective. Not that these distinctions aren't useful in an everyday way, but reifying them as absolute. I hope that neutral monism is a conceptual antidote to that. Now, I'll end on this. I do think, though, I feel obligated to say that, this is a quote from William Seeger, that I think there's one thing that you can't weasel out of in this relational fashion. Because what I've tried to do is get rid of entities, get rid of substance, get rid of all these divisions, right, and relationalize everything. But I think, and this is what I was talking about when I was talking about meditative experience, and I think it's really what James was talking about as well. There's one thing left over. You could call it nowness or presence or presentness or whatever. But it's what gives reality, right? I mean, that sense of, that things are really happening. That nowness, right? And when that nowness is not part of experience, then you think of it as memory or not real or whatever. I'll stop there. Thank you.